We usually have poetry and fiction. I do love those readings, but it's really a treat to have nonfiction books, drones and death and parenting and gender identity issues. And I'm really proud of the bookstore bringing up these topics that are really important to our society. And I'm really proud of you all for coming. So thank you. Tonight, we welcome Jackson Shultz to present his new book, Trans Portraits, Voices from Transgender Communities. And originally from Eastern Washington, he's a long way from home. He attended Washington State University as an undergraduate where he majored in women's studies. He's long been a mentor for youth and has served as an educator in 3 countries. He's the education director and executive board member of the nonprofit organization Teach Alliance. And through this organization, he's presented at national conferences, has moderated support groups, has led trainings for university, faculty, staff, and administrators on supporting the unique needs of the LGBTQI community. And he recently completed his master's at Dartmouth, and he now teaches creative writing and composition at New England College, where he's also working towards his doctorate in higher education administration. Actually, this book was released last fall, but we first learned about it last spring from Jack Turco, who came in and told us about the book, and he said that if we wanted to read one book to understand transgender issues, this was the book. So I'm very happy to have Jackson here tonight and ask you to help me welcome him.
How's it sound in the back? Pretty good? Okay. Still good? All right. Well, thank you, first of all, everybody, for being here. And a huge thanks to the Norwich Bookstore and Liza and everybody who's been involved in making this event happen. I am very excited to be here, and I'm very humbled by how many people are in this room learning about transgender issues. That's very encouraging to me, both as a trans person and as an author of trans topics. So I'm very excited about that. I would like to leave a lot of time for questions and answers at the end, because I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, and I hopefully have enough answers. So I'm going to go ahead and get started without a lot of fanfare. But first, I'm going to switch to an even thicker pair of bifocals so I can read to you. So just a little bit of background about the book. This is an oral history project. I started it when I was a master's student at Dartmouth. I had a really unique opportunity to travel around the country and talk with 34 transgender individuals. I talked to a few more than that, but 34 people had their stories make it into the book. And so I went to conferences all over the country, and I really got to interview people from very, very diverse backgrounds, with really, at the beginning, the only commonality being that they were all transgender identified. So most of the stories that we will hear tonight are directly from those interviews, but I'm going to provide a little bit of hopefully helpful narration to contextualize. So we'll start with that. Although we cannot remember them, our first experiences in the world are typically based on our sex. Following the cry of "it's a girl" or "it's a boy," we will be given a pink or blue armband, respectively. From that moment, we have been assigned a gender based on our biological sex. Girls will frequently be socialized to play with dolls, to spend time indoors, and to be passive. Boys will often be socialized to play with toy cars, to spend time outdoors, and to be assertive. We will spend the next years of our lives meeting or failing the gendered expectations that friends, family, and society have placed upon us. Most will conform to the gender they have been assigned. The following is an oral history of 34 individuals who did not. All of these individuals fall into the broad category of transgender. As an umbrella term, trans or transgender describes anyone who feels discomfort with the gender they were assigned at birth. Some trans individuals physically transition, a process wherein a person takes medical steps to bring their body more in line with the gender with which they identify. Others forego medical procedures and transition socially, taking non-medical steps to express their genders in the ways that are most in line with the gender with which they identify. Whether socially or medically, transitioning from one gender to another is always a complicated process. There are medical and legal difficulties that must be considered, and there are also social barriers that must be crossed. Although many people recognize their transgender feelings at an early age, they're not always presented with the information or resources needed to make an informed decision about transitioning. Increasingly, trans folk are disclosing their trans identities at younger and younger ages, but in older generations, there still exist many trans folk who felt forced to suppress their feelings and desires for years in order to better assimilate to a dominant culture that encourages prescribed binary gender roles. There are those who transition neatly from one gender to the next, and there are those whose gender identities are fluid and frequently changing. Of the 34 individuals included in this book, none of them use the same terminology to refer to themselves. One of the challenges I faced in writing this book was the inadequacy of the English language for discussing gender. For example, several of the interviewees preferred to use gender-neutral pronouns. These pronouns look and sound unnatural, but that same awkwardness can make a pointed political statement about how ingrained a binary gender paradigm is in the dominant culture of the United States. Adequate terminology likewise failed many of the individuals I interviewed, and they often turned to slang, which is a form of expression that has unfortunately been delegitimized in many socioeconomic contexts. The breadth of words that trans communities have invented or reclaimed is astounding, political, and poignant. The terminology they use is often critical to conveying their gender identities and expressions, and creating and using these terms is frequently an important part of their daily activism. The experiences of each of the interviewees differ greatly based on factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, ability, sexuality, HIV status, religion, and a plethora of additional social influences. The characters are so diverse that I often felt they had very few common denominators. However, one of the commonalities I discovered was an overwhelming involvement in activist endeavors. Their definitions of activism were as varied as their gender expressions, but every single interviewee participated regularly in activist pursuits. From large protests to political lobbying, from educational outreach to using a set of pronouns that sparks a conversation, each of the characters told me stories of engaging in activism in their everyday lives. This project has been an incredible journey. I've had an amazing opportunity to delve into the stories of dozens of incredible transgender individuals. The accounts they gave me of their lives were both inspiring and heartbreaking as we probed into the uncharted territories that lie beyond the gender binary. So before we hear from the interviewees, I'll provide just a little bit more narration to contextualize the upcoming stories. While many transgender people recognize cross-gender feelings at an early age, they're not always presented with the information or resources that they need to make an informed decision about whether socially or physically transitioning might be right for them. Trans folk often suppress their feelings and desires for years because they lack the vocabulary needed to express their gender identity to others, because they wish to, or are forced to, better assimilate to a dominant culture that encourages prescribed binary gender roles, because they don't know that transitioning is an option, or because the most commonly discussed trajectories for transition do not fit with their own sense of self. So first we'll hear from Curtis, who transitioned from female to male when he was 17. He disclosed his trans identity to his family when he was 15. He says, "I was a tomboy when I was a kid. There's not a single picture of me before junior high where I don't have a short haircut. Whenever we'd go to the salon, I'd look through the haircut books and I'd always reach for the boys' book. My mom would tell me I had to pick from the girls' book, so I'd pick the shortest haircut I could find. It was okay to be a tomboy up until the time I hit junior high. Once you get to about 12 or 13, it's no longer socially acceptable for a girl to be so rough and tumble. I grew my hair out and I tried to wear makeup and dresses, but I felt wretched about it. After months of attempting to assimilate to what the other girls in my grade were doing, and failing miserably, I tried to kill myself. I took a cocktail of prescription and non-prescription medications. Luckily for me, prescription death isn't instantaneous. I had a lot of time between when I took the pills and when they started to work. I became terrified. I ran into my mom's bedroom in the middle of the night and told her what I had done. She drove me to the emergency room where they induced hours of vomiting to get everything out of my system. My follow-up care required me to see a psychiatrist and to take antidepressants. The problem was it didn't treat my depression. Depression was merely a symptom of a larger issue, not the problem itself. It wasn't until I was 14 that I finally figured out the cause for my depression. I was flipping through a Teen People magazine, and I found an article about transgender youth. I read the article over and over again. It's been 10 years, and I still have that magazine stashed away in my closet. That article gave me the vocabulary I had been lacking my entire life. I finally knew what I needed to do. Next, we'll hear from Bella, who is an ensign in the U.S. Navy and transitioned when she was 52. She says, I transitioned when I was 52. My whole life, I had known I was different, but I could never put a finger on exactly what the problem was. As a poor black man, I felt that college was beyond my reach, so like most of my high school buddies, I joined the Navy. The great thing about being in the military was that I didn't have to think. People told me what to wear, when to eat, when to sleep, and when to use the latrine. I liked being a sailor because all of my decisions were made for me, and I didn't have to think about who I wanted to be. When I got out of the Navy and I had more time to think, I realized that I had all of these feelings. I didn't know what to do about them, but oh, were they there. I talked to people and I did some reading, but the tales I heard over and over again were about white gay men who transitioned to become straight women. Well, there wasn't any place for a man who was attracted to women and who wanted to be a woman himself. I couldn't find myself reflected in their stories. That's the problem. When you're a person of color, your stories just aren't told. Even now that I can look up whatever I fancy on the internet, I can hear all of these stories and I can find all of this information, but none of it is my truth. For years and years, we've been put under the magnifying glass while white doctors and psychiatrists have written volumes of books about us, and we haven't got to say a word about it. Our voices have been silenced long enough. It's about damn time that somebody let us tell our truths. Information about trans issues and identities is not widely taught in primary, secondary, or even tertiary education settings, and is infrequently discussed in positive or realistic ways by the media. For some, discovering vocabulary around non-binary genders or information about transition is the first step in experimenting with gender expression. Even when this information is known, deciding whether or not it personally applies presents an additional barrier. Some must also break through heavy walls of socially ingrained denial. And on that note, we'll hear from Catherine, who is 61 and is an orthopedic nurse. She says, people always ask me, when did you know you were supposed to be a girl? That's not the question. The real question is, when did I find out I wasn't? At 4, 5, and 6 years old, I just assumed I was a girl. When I was 9 or 10, I realized my feelings were starting to look permanent. We asked kids to believe in Santa Claus. Believing I was a girl was not that big of a stretch. When I was 12 years old, I found my denial mode. I figured out how I was going to survive. Denial is the strongest force in the universe. Unfortunately, denial is single use. Once it's gone, it's over. 30 years later, I needed to take a few continuing education courses to keep my nurse's license valid. I took a sexuality course that was taught by a gender therapist, which was something I didn't know when I enrolled. Sitting in the class with her, I realized that many of the topics hit too close to home. I carried the phone number of that instructor around for 5 years. When I finally called, I said, hey, this is so-and-so. I don't know if you remember me, but I took a class from you about 5 years ago. She said, oh, I remember you. At our first appointment, she leaned forward, and where most people would say, now what brought you here today? She said, what took you so long? While there's been some media exposure on gay, lesbian, and bisexual identities, little accurate information exists in popular media about trans identities. Disclosing a trans identity to partners, friends, or family can be a difficult undertaking. So we'll hear from Bella again, who was the one who was in the Navy. She says, "The fights would start anytime my wife and I had to get dressed up to go somewhere. Weddings, funerals, and graduations. They were all sources of contention between us. It took me years to pin down exactly why I became so haughty and angry around these events. I became moody as we were getting ready, sullen in the car, and by the time we arrived, I was a real ass. For the longest time, I just thought I was antisocial. My wife was the one who figured out what the problem was. We had never talked about the possibility of me transitioning. I never once brought up my cross-gender feelings in all of the years we had been together. Yet somehow she knew exactly what I had been battling in my head my entire life. We were getting ready for a friend's wedding, and I started my routine of pouting. The groom was a Navy buddy of mine, and I was expected to wear my old Navy uniform. My wife came up to me, laid her hand on my arm, and said, "You only have to wear it for a little while." That was the moment when I realized why all of these events made me so angry. I was jealous that all of the women got to wear beautiful, sparkling dresses, and I was stuck in a suit or a tux. First of all, it wasn't fair that I had to wear a cummerbund. And second, those dresses would have looked better on me. My wife was so compassionate and understood my anger and dysphoria better than I did. I put on my Navy uniform and we went out. It was the most fun I've ever had at a wedding because I knew that my uniform was just a costume that I had to wear for a few hours. It wasn't who I really was. When we got home that night, my wife asked, "Of all of the dresses we saw tonight, which one do you think would look best on you?" I replied in the shakiest voice, "The mauve cocktail dress that Charla was wearing." And she simply smiled and said, "That's the one I was thinking too. Think we ought to get you one?" I hugged my wife and we both cried for hours. So many marriages end when one partner transitions, but my marriage became stronger. There are no more secrets between us. In researching and writing this book, I found many instances of balance. I think for every tale of rejection, there's a tale of acceptance. Hopefully this ratio is starting to shift more toward acceptance, but I found stories that indicated otherwise as well. So on the note of balance, we'll hear from Wendy, who worked in international finance prior to her transition. She said, "My wife and I had been married for 23 years before I told her I wanted to be a woman. During that entire time, I never once dressed or undressed in front of her. That's not an easy feat to maintain for 23 years. I was ashamed of my body. I could barely look at myself, let alone have anyone else look at me. I was always partially clothed during intimacy. It was so difficult to want to have sex. I was attracted to my wife, but I hated my body so much. Every time I became aroused, I was disgusted with my body, so I wouldn't want to be intimate. My wife thought I wasn't attracted to her, and she felt badly about herself. One evening, we were arguing about the frequency, or lack thereof, of our intimacy. She blamed herself. She said we weren't intimate because she wasn't attractive. I couldn't let her carry on thinking that. "You're beautiful," I told her. "I don't want to make love because I hate my body. Every time we go at it, I'm reminded that I'm a man, and I don't want to be a man anymore." She definitely realized that the problem wasn't her, but she also realized she didn't want to be married to a freak. It wasn't long after that conversation that she filed for divorce. Transition is a personal and nuanced experience, and there's no standard definition of the word. Social transitions often, but not always, include asking others to use one's preferred name and pronouns, as well as expressing gender outwardly in a way that reflects one's internal identity. Medical transitions can include hormone replacement therapy, during which a person takes cross-sex hormones to alter their secondary sex characteristics. Female to male individuals often take testosterone to achieve masculinizing effects. Male to female individuals often take estrogen along with additional medications to block testosterone production in order to achieve feminizing effects. Surgical options are numerous and varied. Gender confirmation surgery is a recent umbrella term that encompasses all surgical procedures intended to affirm one's desired gender. Many male to female individuals will have genital reassignment surgery. Many female to male individuals will undergo breast removal but avoid genital reassignment surgery. Some will transition socially, but not medically. Others, especially genderqueer or gender nonconforming individuals, will have surgeries without hormones or vice versa. Medical transitioning is a time-consuming and costly process, but many feel medical transition is necessary in order to express their gender in the ways that are most authentic to them. In fact, there's been a body of medical research on the mental health benefits of transition. So we'll hear a few transition stories. The first from Kelly, who came out to her family as a girl when she was 12. She's now a student at the University of Northern Iowa. She says, "I was only 12 when I came out to my family. Luckily, my moms are lesbians, so not only were they unsurprised by my revelation, but they were also really supportive. Being a part of the LGBT community, they already knew trans women who could point them in the right direction. I'm one of those extremely lucky people who came out before I started puberty. My mom's pushed really hard for me to be able to take puberty-suppressing hormones. Basically, hormone blockers just give trans youth a medication that tells your body to press pause on puberty. Once you've met the other therapy requirements, you can start taking estrogen or testosterone and go through puberty as your desired sex rather than your biological sex. The standards of care suggest that youth wait until they are 16 to start taking testosterone or estrogen, but my mom's convinced my doctor to let me start taking estrogen when I was 14. I'm one of those very rare trans women who hasn't had to have any surgeries in order to pass. I never went through puberty as a boy, so I didn't get that tall. My shoulders aren't wide, I don't have an Adam's apple, and I never got hairy. Most trans women are fighting against all of the effects of having gone through puberty, so they have to take estrogen along with other testosterone-blocking medications. Many of them will have their trachea shaved to reduce the size of their Adam's apple. I never had to go through electrolysis because I didn't have a beard. I never had to go to voice coaching because my voice never dropped. Come to think of it, neither did anything else." While most of the people that we've heard from so far tonight identify as binary gender, so either male or female, there are a number of non-binary individuals I interviewed as well. Jamie is one of those individuals, and they identify as genderqueer and use they and their as their pronouns. They work at the health center at the University of Connecticut. So they say, "There are so many queer people who hate labeling themselves. I enjoy labels because I can mash them all together. I like cutting up the boxes and creating pretty pictures with them, finding as many words as I can to describe different parts of me. I identify as genderqueer because I don't feel that I'm a guy or a girl. At the same time, I don't feel comfortable presenting as feminine, so I'm somewhat transmasculine. I figured out about a year ago that there were terms for people who weren't one sex or the other, that there were a whole host of non-binary terms. I began to think that maybe not everyone had to work as hard as I did to keep up the act of trying to fit into their genders. I met a few trans boys who were genderqueer, and I both liked them and wanted to be them. It was the first time I really realized that there was something other than bisexuality happening within my life. I'm on a really low dose of transdermal testosterone, and I might have top surgery someday, but I'm primarily read as androgynous. It's been difficult navigating queer spaces as somebody with a non-binary gender identity. The queer community really like their boxes. Even a lot of mainstream transgender communities are unwelcoming to non-binary people. They exhibit the same type of attitude you get from a lot of mainstream gay and lesbian communities. Oh, you're bisexual? Get off the fence and decide. They fail to understand that androgyny, just like bisexuality, is really a place. So, trans folks often experience high rates of depression, which are often related to issues of body dysphoria, familial rejection, and a lack of societal acceptance. Blake is a member of the Mojave tribe and a professor of disability studies in Colorado. And he says, "Many years ago, I tried to kill myself. I was living with an undiagnosed illness that caused me terrible grief. I had so much guilt from leaving my parents and my tribe to pursue my PhD, and there was something wrong with me that I just couldn't put my finger on. At that time, it didn't occur to me that I might be two-spirit. I know there's a history of gender variation among the Mojave, but it's not something that's often recognized these days. Contemporary Mojave culture often neglects tradition, and I never even heard the word wame until I was taking a Native American studies course as a master's student. And this is a word for a person who's assigned female at birth who adopts a masculine role in Mojave culture. Without any way to express the gnawing desire that I had festering inside me, I was intimately depressed. One night, all of my feelings got the better of me, and I walked down to a busy overpass. Someone apparently spotted me and followed me as I was nearing it. I hadn't heard him, so I was startled when he called out to me. He said, "Hey, I think I know what you're thinking about, and I've been there too. Let me buy you a cup of coffee and let's talk." I spilled my soul to this guy. He's now one of my best friends, and even after 30 years, we still get together on a regular basis. When I finally did figure out that I was going to transition, he was the very first person I told. Him talking to me that night didn't solve all of my problems. I certainly still needed help, but sometimes all it takes is just one person reaching out, and that can be enough to sustain you. Next, we'll hear from Mosley, who identifies as stud and masculine of center, which are terms that are most often used in Black transgender communities. Mosley was the former advisor to Black students here at Dartmouth. She said, "Having a sense of community is vital. When you're queer, the world is actively trying to get you to be anything other than who you are, so we need to provide spaces that get us to feel comfortable in our own skin. Having a sense of self and a sense of health and wellness is going to translate into all facets of our lives. If we feel worthy, if we feel empowered, and if we love ourselves, that's going to show up in our style, in the workplace, in our relationships, and in the way we treat others. It's going to show up in how successful we conceptualize ourselves as being." So some of the interviewees posed the question, what happens to those of us with multiple identities? So I devote a chapter to the concept of intersectionality, and I think this is a really important question. Intersectionality is the idea that multiple facets of a person's identity simultaneously intersect, and that individuals experience oppression based on these intersections. So race, gender, sexuality, ability, and socioeconomic status are a few of the many identity attributes that coexist and interact with one another as various elements of a complete whole, and are inextricable from one another. So, for example, one of the interviewees, Supriya, stated, "I'm always simultaneously a woman, and a woman of color, and a trans woman." Within LGBTQI communities, intersectionality can be a site of unity or a source of contention. LGBTQI individuals exist within every race, ethnicity, and religion. They come from all socioeconomic backgrounds and have varying abilities and disabilities. Commonality is often overlooked, and there are major fractionalizations based around identity politics, respectability politics, and community goals. Many individuals who transition experience a noticeable difference in the ways in which they're treated by others based on their genders. Trans men often experience many aspects of male privilege after transition, while trans women frequently encounter sexism or misogyny. Genderqueer and other non-binary individuals range in experiences depending on how their gender is perceived by others. So we'll hear from Raphael, who works at an immigrant rights organization in Chicago. Says, "I mostly identify as masculine of center and stud. These terms incorporate not only gender identity and expression, but also race, which is really important to me. As an interracial individual, I try to stay away from terms like transsexual and other identity labels that have been traditionally used in white communities. I see myself as an amalgamation within the matrices of identity. I'm masculine of center and also a person of color and also queer. I need terminology that addresses all of these aspects because all of those things come together to shape my existence. I find very often that I end up being the spokesperson for entire communities by virtue of being the only person in those communities. I'm Latino, I'm Black, I'm masculine of center, and I'm often asked to speak for each of these communities in turn. That's not how it works. I'm not here to educate you, nor should anyone be forced to play the spokesperson for an entire group of people. We need more coalitions, more diversity, and more allies to bear some of the burdens of educating others." Having an intersectional identity is very complex. Our identities are so intertwined, it's impossible to separate different parts of the whole. Likewise, the struggles that face both the transgender communities and other communities, such as disability communities, are often intersectional and inextricable. Disabled and differently abled transgender individuals embody this intricate intersectionality and show just how connected disability and trans identities can be. Just a little bit more. Okay. So we'll hear from Hillary, who's an organic chemist in Virginia. Hillary says, although I'm deaf, I pass very easily because I lip read, and I don't speak with much of a deaf accent unless I'm tired. My parents are not deaf, but there are other deaf people in my family, so I grew up learning to function in both hearing and deaf spaces. In the deaf community, we have some bizarre gender policing. Someone will transition and will be harassed for suddenly not signing in a way consistent with their gender. Since I've transitioned, people will say to me, "You're signing in a very masculine way." I was taught to sign in a certain way. This is my voice in the deaf community. I don't really know how to sign in a more feminine way, and I'm not sure I want to learn. I'm happy with the way I sign, and I shouldn't have to change it because others expect me to sign in the way that they think I should. In the hearing world, I'm frequently policed about my voice, which I cannot hear and cannot consciously change. I can't. Besides the fact that I don't want to, I don't know what it means to speak higher or lower. For goodness sakes, I can't hear. Another chapter is devoted to issues of discrimination. So discrimination and bias are daily occurrences for many transgender individuals. Whether facing institutionalized oppressions or interpersonal violence, the bias that trans folk encounter can be rather overwhelming. So we're going to hear next from Catherine again, who was the orthopedic nurse. She says, an old friend, 5 years gone, once said that she'd never consider any trans person to be out of danger. Every single trans person has had at least one trans friend who has been murdered, taken their own life, or needlessly died because they were too afraid to seek medical care. My friend Julie died just last year because she put off going to the doctor. She was afraid of how she'd be treated. We're terrified, so we don't put ourselves in vulnerable situations willingly, and our small medical problems can become really big issues really fast. We're going to hear from Vicky next, who's in her 20s and lives with her parents in New Mexico. And although my interviews with Vicky were very brief, they're the interviews that stick with me the most, because I think her experience is really powerful. She says, I've had cross-gender feelings my entire life, but I've only had the vocabulary to express my identity for the past few years. I knew I wanted to transition, but when I brought it up with my counselor, my other mental health issues came into play. I put myself in a vulnerable state by telling my counselor that I was transgender and intended on transitioning. She replied, but you have schizoaffective disorder. How can you possibly know that you're trans? How could you possibly know what's real about your identity? That's how I feel. Happily stated. Next, we'll hear from Felipe, who is a project controls manager for a construction company in Alaska. He says, in Alaska, you can still lose your job or be evicted for being gay, much less trans. I'm protected through my company, which is one of the reasons I picked them. All of these companies are playing the resources game because there aren't enough experienced and educated individuals in this area. Oftentimes, another company will try to recruit me, but because they don't have policies for LGBT folks in place, I won't even look at them. It gets really hard to explain why without outing myself. I'm protected right now, and I will not lose my job over being trans. If I move to another company, I could. I feel some amount of comfort knowing that I have some protection in place. At the same time, my roommate and I could all get evicted at any point for being gay, so working in Alaska still has its downsides. Just as intersectionality impacts identity, it also impacts the way that we experience discrimination. Supriya moved from the U.S. To the U.S. from India to pursue her MD. She says, the last time I visited my family in India, I had a layover in Turkey. I was stopped in the airport no fewer than 6 times. 6 times I was asked to remove my shoes or other parts of my clothing. 6 times I was asked a series of invasive questions about my gender, about my nationality, and about my green card. 6 times my bag was unceremoniously searched. Before I left the US, I was standing in line for coffee prior to my flight, and an officer pulled me out of the queue and submitted me to hours of questioning. I was viewed as a suspicious person. I don't think there is anything brow-raising about my drink order. I suspect that my real crime was flying while brown. Of course, once they took me into a back room, they asked to see all of my documents. My passport, my green card, and other forms of ID were all obtained at different times. In some of the pictures I look more masculine, and in some I look more feminine. Even though all of my IDs say female, and they say my correct name, I received each one at a different point in transition, so they do not necessarily reflect me exactly as I look now. A simple interrogation led to hours of investigation, while I explained over and over again why my ID pictures were inconsistent. They finally let me leave, but I had missed my flight. While discrimination continues to be an issue, I think that many policies and prejudices are beginning to change. And I think in part that's because of the activism that I see happening within these communities and outside of these communities. And one of the most remarkable trends that I found when collecting these interviews was this tendency toward activism. Nearly every individual whose voice is featured in this project engages in activism on a regular basis. Even Felipe, the individual in Alaska, who is stealth, so he doesn't tell people that he's trans, he still finds ways to give back to his community. Just like their stories of transition, there's no single trajectory of how the interviewees came to be activists or how they define activism. We'll hear from Greg now, who is an architecture student at the University of Pennsylvania. He says, "My activism predates my transition. I was already active in education through a series of speakers bureaus and outreach events on my campus. We had very few trans folks on our panels, so I started making trans issues a talking point. Little did I realize that I was becoming a bastion for a cause that I would get to know even more intimately over the coming years. I feel that a lot of trans folk become activists not because they necessarily want to, but because there's a certain amount of need. You can't change the gender marker on your driver's license? You can't find a doctor who's willing to treat you? You can't find a safe restroom? No one else is going to take care of these issues because their lives aren't affected by them each and every day. As you deal with prejudice on a daily basis, you start picking and choosing which battles are the most important to you, and then you start educating the people around you. Even if they never intended for it to happen, I believe most trans people become accidental activists." And there are many, many stories of activism in here, which we don't have time to read right now. But we're going to hear from Mosley, who is, again, the former advisor to black students at Dartmouth, and who is active as part of an organization called Queer Boys, which is a style blog and informational blog for masculine of center and trans-masculine black individuals. She says, "Getting flack is part of activism, and that's been true for Queer Boys. For some folks, we're not urban enough. For some people, we're not black enough. For some people, we're not trans-inclusive enough. And for some folks, we don't do enough talking about more things around identity and oppression. We're not political enough, or we're too political. When people send us scathing criticisms, I always think, A, do you realize how much time and energy it takes to do this? And B, thank you for being engaged enough to send this. Because if you didn't care about it, we wouldn't even be having these conversations right now. Critique at least lets us know that these dialogues are happening. We take it in stride. It's really important to recognize that we're evolving. The site has taken on its own kind of identity based on feedback that we've gotten as we move forward. We're constantly sorting through that feedback, affirming some of it and discarding some of it, but making sure that we're staying true to who we are. I think there is beauty in the fact that these arguments and conversations are happening. We try to be as authentic to our goal and our core as we can. It's like fishing. You're putting it out there with the hope that someone will bite it. There's a Dolly Parton quote that goes something along the lines of, "You could be the sweetest, most delicious Georgia peach, but there's always going to be an SOB who doesn't like peach cobbler." And we'll end the reading part of tonight with one last quote from Catherine, who is the orthopedic nurse. She says, I look at these young trans kids who pass beautifully because they got to take hormone blockers when they were still prepubescent and transition to hormones as teens. Many of them will never need the surgeries I have had in order to pass. They will never face the same violence and ridicule as the people in my generation did. When I look around and I see these kids transitioning and these kids who have family support, I know that every battle that we waged was worth it. Thank you. So we'll leave it here for now. I'm going to put my seeing people glasses back on, and we can open the floor for questions.
How did you find these?
Good question. All right, so the question was how, the question was, how did I find all of these people? Primarily through conferences. There are a lot of conferences specifically for LGBT communities or transgender communities throughout the US and Canada, and I attended most of them over the year that I wrote this book, and just had a lot of very organic conversations with people. A lot of folks were people that I met at these conferences, and sometimes they would give me names and numbers of other people that they knew in their own communities at home, and it sort of grew organically from there. Sure, in the back.
You may have already explained this, but when you say blank of center, that expression you're using, what exactly does that mean? Like you were saying masculine of center. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
Sure. So to repeat the question was, what exactly does masculine of center or feminine of center mean? So the idea would be, if gender exists on a spectrum, you would have very, very strong masculinity at one end and very hyper femininity at the other end. And if you were in the center of that, that might be a neutral zone or combinations of the two. If you moved a little bit farther down the spectrum toward masculinity, that would be masculine of center. If you moved closer to this end, it would be feminine of center. That's sort of that, coming from the concept that gender is a vast spectrum. Excellent.
So what do you make of the fact that, I think you said something along the lines of everybody was involved in some level with, is that coincidence? Or do you draw the conclusion that if you are in a transition phase at all, you're by definition going to be an activist? Or do you assume that there are many out there that aren't, you're not aware of because they're not active at all, or they're living a quiet life of being transitioned?
Sure. So the question for people in the back was the conclusions I draw about the fact that everybody in this book was involved in some way in activism, and whether that might extend out to a larger sample size of the population. Am I understanding that correctly?
Basically, I'm just curious about the coincidence of, if you are going through this, you're an activist.
Right. Okay. So if you are transitioning, that you are an activist. I personally, I don't think necessarily that it dictates that you have to be an activist. I don't know that it's necessarily coincidental that everybody in here is an activist either. I think in terms of the populations that I was speaking to, as I said, I found most people via conferences, and a lot of people who are willing to go to these conferences are either there to seek information. Some of the people were presenting at these conferences, and a lot of people involved in these conferences are very political in their activism as well. So I think there's a wide range of people. I think, of course, you're going to get some people who transition who do not engage directly in activism, but I'm defining activism very broadly. So we're not just talking about large political rallies. We're talking about sort of instances of everyday activism. And I think that in that sense, nearly all trans folk engage in that in some way, because the onus is often put on trans folk to play the role of educator. And so if you're the only trans person in your family, you're probably going to do a lot of education. You're having conversations with people in your community explaining what is gender, what is sex, what are the differences between gender and sex. And a lot of conversations that sort of spark better understanding, I think. And so I think in this way, almost everybody engages in sort of a micro level of activism.
Are there any key political issues that we should all be aware of as voters that would improve sort of society in general for trans folks?
I like your question. All right, so the question was, are there any key political issues that general society as voters should be aware of that might help this community? There are always political issues that are really important. So, as Felipe mentioned, in many states, you can be fired on the basis of your gender identity or expression, right? So how you present your gender, how you identify with your gender. So that means that anybody who's transgender or non-binary could be fired simply for being who they are. That's a problem. There are these sort of non-discrimination bills that will come up in terms of employment, in terms of housing. Again, Felipe said in Alaska that you can still be evicted for being transgender. That's a major issue. Not all of these things would go to vote, but they are always issues that you can call your state representatives and tell them, hey, I don't support this bill that's coming through right now. There are many other bathroom bills that have been introduced. So these are laws that are put on the books that say something usually like, if you are using a public restroom, a public facility, you can only use the bathroom that matches the sex put on your birth certificate. Well, in many states, Idaho being one of them, if you were born in Idaho, no matter what you do, no matter what surgery you have, you can't change the sex on your birth certificate. Other states, like its neighbor Washington, you can call up the Secretary of State and say, hey, I'm taking hormones, change the gender on my birth certificate, and they will. So because we have a lot of discrepancies in laws throughout the states, requirements for that are based on your identification are really tricky when it comes to bathrooms. Usually sort of these bathroom bills are targeting transgender people who you might say are obviously transgender people, right? People that we can identify and say, I'm not quite sure what that person's gender is. They are often genderqueer people who have issues with bathrooms. Like, I can go into a men's bathroom and I'm never going to have an issue with it. My birth certificate says female. Legally, in some parts of the country, I can't go into a men's bathroom. But if I went into a women's bathroom, that would lead to a lot of harassment. People would say, why are you here? Right? So there are many issues that usually have to do with binary spaces like that that voters should definitely be aware of.
Quick follow-up question. What about specific to New Hampshire or Vermont, where we all vote?
Okay. So specific to New Hampshire or Vermont.
Yeah.
Vermont's pretty good.
Vermont's
pretty good. New Hampshire's more iffy. New Hampshire, I think, has recently changed the way that you change the gender marker on your driver's license to make it easier, but it's still a difficult undertaking. Still requires letters of support from therapists and doctors, and you have to have somebody else, usually a physician, prove what your gender is. And the only person that I know who knows what their gender is the person you're asking.
But in all fairness to New Hampshire, 3 years ago, you had to get surgery in order to change it. Now there is a form that they at least have you can download, and you're right, the physician has to just document that a person is living as a female or a male. So it's a tremendous step forward, I think.
I agree. Yeah.
So,
Throughout the process, what surprised you the most?
So the question was, throughout the process of writing, I'm assuming,
Yes.
and interviewing,
Yes.
what surprised me the most?
Of developing the book.
Of developing the book. All right. Wasn't sure where we were going with this. I thought it was going to be more of a bummer than it was. Like, I really thought I was going to encounter a lot of really negative stories. And another trend that I found that we didn't talk about here, in part because this is being filmed and there are certain words I can't say on local access television, there is a trend in here about gallows humor. And so this is the idea that when a situation is really sad and depressing, and your life is really terrible, the only thing that you can do sometimes is laugh. And a lot of people were really, really humorous in the ways that they dealt with these sort of situations. And that surprised me. That's something that I do. It's something that's really important in my life, but I found that it was a trend with a lot of people, that sort of the idea that laughter is the best medicine, and when we can't do anything else about this really unfortunate situation with discrimination or prejudice, we're going to find ways to laugh about it.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about allyship, beyond the question that was asked, which was a great question, and beyond just slacktivism, Could you talk a little bit about what you'd like to see and how people can be allies?
Sure. So the question was, how can people be better allies to this particular community? And I think that the number one issue is education. Being here, getting a little bit of exposure to these issues is a huge first step. And that's why I'm so encouraged that this room is so full. I also think that sharing the information that you learn with others is huge, right? Because it reduces the burden that's put on transgender people to do this. As I said earlier in a definition of activism, part of that is just educating the people around you. And that's something that is exhausting. If this is your identity and this is something that you're faced with doing day after day after day, it can be really hard. A couple of people said that they feel that trans people are very active in the beginning of their transition. They're youthful about their transition. They're excited. They really want to be involved. They're living and breathing everything to do with gender identity. And then they burn out. It gets really difficult to maintain that level of being an educator for everybody all the time and being really nice about it, doing it with a smile on your face. And so some of that burden needs to fall on allies, in my opinion. I think it's really important to have as many people as we can go out with this message about even basic things about what gender is, what sex is, what a transgender identity means and looks like, and that it's not the same for everybody. These are fairly heterogeneous stories in a lot of ways. They're very diverse. Nobody's transition experience looks the same. And I think that's a huge message that other people can do in terms of allyship. I think a lot of that education is really, let me start that over. I think education is really sort of the first part to compassion. I think people are very much scared of what they don't understand and what they don't know, and I think that's where we see all of these bathroom bills coming from. People are afraid of what's going on because they don't understand what's going on. And I think if more people knew what these bathroom bills meant from the perspective of trans people, what it means to have to hold your bladder for 8 hours at work because there's not a bathroom that you can use and you constantly have urinary tract infections because it's not healthy to do that, I think people need to know that. I think that's a message that allies can sort of start sharing and tell other people so that we can start building some compassion and work from a place of love when we're doing this sort of activism.
Okay, we can do one more. That's a great place to end, but if we've got one more question, we can go
Sure.
ahead.
Okay.
Would you talk about the resources available for kids that are, say, 7 or 8, and the process as it relates to the schools?
Sure. So the question was resources that are available for children who are around 7 or 8 and sort of those processes as they relate to schools. Many school districts have different guidelines for what they do with transgender youth in terms of what bathroom that child might be using at school. Some of those situations are better than others. There is a case in Maine where gonna forget her name. Nicole Maines, thank you. Won a court case to be able to use the women's bathroom and locker room at school. There are resources. There's a really, I love books, obviously, I hope we all do. There's a really wonderful book called The Transgender Child that has a lot of resources specific to schools, and I can give you more information about that if you want to talk to me later. But I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah.
So it leads me to the, if you're homosexual or lesbian, it's not as imperative to figure it out before puberty because you don't have the estrogen or testosterone issues or et cetera. But I find it really difficult to allow a child. I mean, how do we know we're not forcing a child along the line or something? I mean, this is obviously I don't know very many transgender people and I'm not exposed as much to it, but I really worry about how do we really know that an 8-year-old is a different gender? And I'm certainly familiar with tomboys. Ours a tomboy, but I'm very feminine. You know, I mean, I'm worried that people's agendas might get involved.
Yeah, so I think that that's a really interesting question. And when it comes to youth who are very young, transitioning or saying that they identify in a way that's different from the sex that they were assigned at birth, people have sort of a visceral reaction to that sometimes. Part of we talked a little bit about puberty suppressing hormones, and there are really, really great encouraging studies right now that are happening that are saying that youth who have not hit puberty yet, if they are put on puberty suppressing hormones, that just presses pause on their pituitary. And so they don't go through puberty either direction. And that gives us more time to say, is this child actually transgender? Do they actually want to transition? Are they just a tomboy or a very feminine sort of boy? And will they continue to have these feelings later? So they can take these puberty suppressing hormones for a number of years. We can wait until they're 15 or 16 before we give them testosterone or estrogen, or we can take them off of those hormones and they will go through their biologic puberty in the same way. But another response that I'll say to that, a lot of people get sort of up in arms saying, how can we let a child who's 13 or 14 or 15 years old decide that they want to change their sex or their gender? The response is sort of, children at the age of 14 or 15 or 16 years old are making the decision to kill themselves. And I think that's really the answer.
Well, that's a harder note to end on.
we could go back to love.
Go back to
love.
But we can continue the conversation more informally. Thank you
Thank you.
so much.